My name is Serena Vale. I am 31 years old, a woman who keeps a tape measure, a notebook, and a stubborn spine in her tote bag at all times. And I live in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in a small upstairs apartment over a nail salon that smells faintly like acetone and jasmine. And I work as a senior sales associate at a bridal boutique called Maison Liora, where everything is white and soft and expensive, and where mirrors lean like tall cousins who want to be invited to every conversation. And my job until this story began was simple and hard. I measured women, I pinned hems, I whispered the truth about fit when a dress was 2 sizes too small, and a dream was 2 sizes too loud. And I loved the part where a shy bride looked at herself and saw the good bones of a life she was about to build. And I hated the part where some coworkers treated the store like a private club where kindness needed a membership. And two of them, Kelsey and Brooke, had a habit of making size a joke. Not in front of customers, never that brave, but in the back room where the steamer fogged the air and the garment bags sighed. They would look at a tag and smirk. They would call a 14A feel fine and a 16 sweet 16 again. They would say things like, if you love the dress will love you back as if fabric is a boyfriend. And I learned to stand between them and the women who trusted us because I am good at standing still in the right place. And I am a size 18 myself, and I wear dresses that fit my rib cage and my lungs and my job, and I am not ashamed. But shame is a smell like bleach. It sneaks in your nose even when you keep the window open. And the day the world tilted was a Saturday in March, 3 months before I signed anyone's paycheck. A busy day with 12 fittings stacked like dominoes, a pop star's cousin on the calendar, a flash sale on veils, weather that made people want to be inside, and I was doing what I always do, smiling with my whole face and my whole back when a group of bridesmaids came in wearing identical pink coats and identical tired expressions. And the bride, a quiet woman named Hallie, had sent her measurements ahead, and the appointment notes said she was nervous about trying on gowns in front of her friends. So I prepped a selection in her range: silk with structure, lace that doesn't itch, magic seams, the good stuff. And I was zipping her into a crepe sheath when Kelsey and Brooke swept into the bay like perfume you didn't ask for. And Brooke said, loud enough for Hallie to hear, we should have pulled the forgiving silhouettes. And Kelsey said, do we have the tent in ivory? And Hallie flinched like a deer when a door slams. And I said, ladies, out. And they laughed and moved 3 inches instead of 5 feet. And I put my hand on the zipper and met Hallie's eyes in the mirror and said, take a breath with me. In for 4, hold, out for 6. The way I teach nervous girls and nervous mothers and the version of myself who sometimes wakes at 3 a.m. And she did. And the dress settled on her like water that knew where it was supposed to be. And I turned her toward the mirror and she whispered, I look like me. And the bridesmaids cried the kind that does not need tissues. And I stepped out to grab a veil. And that is when I heard it. Kelsey's voice in the hall to the stockroom, pitched at that fake whisper volume that is meant to be overheard, saying, it's wild we let Serena style the curvy ones, like letting a bartender taste the top shelf. And Brooke snorted and said, I swear her size climbs every season like our prices. And they both laughed, and I stood there holding a veil and a choice, and the choice was not whether to cry, I would not, and not whether to rage. I did not have time. The choice was how to move the day forward without training everyone in the room to flinch when the word size walked in, so I set the veil down. I finished with Hallie. She bought the gown. She left with a shy smile that made my job feel like a job worth doing. And then I walked into the manager's office and said, I need 5 minutes. And Leora, the owner, looked up from her ledger with the face of a woman who knows profit and fabric and gossip. And I told her what I heard, plain and exact, and she sighed and said, You know how Kelsey and Brooke are. And I said, yes. And I know how I am, and how Hallie is, and how every woman who walked out of here today is. And she said, you're asking me to police small talk. And I said, I'm asking you to protect the brand you put on the hangers and the women who pay for them. And she said, I will talk to them. And she did. And they came into the break room after closing with faces like teenagers at a detention. And Kelsey said, we were joking. And Brooke said, if you can't take a joke, how do you sell to bridesmaids? And I said, I sell to people. And I looked at Leora and said, we need a policy. And Leora said, we'll draft a memo. And I heard in her voice the rustle of a can being kicked. And I made a second choice. I wrote the memo myself. And I wrote it in simple language. A line about dignity, a line about no commentary on bodies, a line about corrective action, and Leora sent it to the staff list with my name in the CC, as if I had given a suggestion and not a spine. And Monday came and nothing changed. And Tuesday came and a girl named Naomi cried in a bathroom because someone giggled behind a curtain when she tried on a sample that would need to be ordered. And Wednesday came and a mother of the bride told me she loved me for protecting her daughter from a whispered, bless her heart. And Thursday, I went home with my jaw locked and my shoulders high. And Friday, I took a long walk around the block before my shift and told myself I could not be the only wall between cheap women and expensive dresses. The shake that turns a situation into an opportunity arrived by email at 9:13 p.m. that Friday. A message from Leora to the whole team with the subject line, Weekend Crush. In it, she announced a confidence campaign on our social pages featuring real talk about fit and feel, and attached a draft grid of posts with quotes Kelsey and Brooke had written without asking anyone they were quoting. Captions that used anonymous she and they, lines like sometimes a big girl needs a big skirt to hide in, smiley face, and the first photo was a back-of-head shot of me pinning a hem with the caption, our curvy specialist knows how to handle extra. And I closed the email and stared at my ceiling and listened to the upstairs neighbor drop a shoe, and I knew what was about to happen. They were going to make $1 off the exact thing I had asked them to stop. And they were going to use my back as a billboard, and a different kind of switch flipped. The one my mother wired into me. She ran a little alteration shop out of our kitchen until her hands could not hold a needle. And she always told me, if people want to make the seam crooked, you straighten the table first. And I got out of bed and made tea. And I wrote a plan in my notebook with a blunt pencil, because blunt pencils make you slow down. Step 1, record dates, words, names. Step 2, capture the email and the grid. Step 3, call my aunt who has run a thrift and consignment store for 20 years and ask her what it cost her when small talk turned into lawsuits. Step 4, call legal aid to ask what constitutes a hostile work environment when it's dressed in silk. Step 5, begin to look for the door I would rather enter than the one they keep half open for me. Monday was a test I passed because I like tests. I kept my head up, I kept my hands kind, and I kept my ears sharp without feeding them. And after my shift, I took a bus across town to see my aunt, and we sat in the back of her shop among prom dresses from last season and cardigans with good bones. And she told me 2 stories. One about a boutique that doubled sales when they hired a plus-size buyer and put her in charge of ordering for everyone, because care scales. And one about a boutique that closed when rumors about the way they talked about bodies turned into a hashtag. And she said, if you can't change the room, build the next one. And I said, with what? I have 3,000 in savings and a stubborn spine. And she said, with what you have that they don't, mercy, measurements, and a spreadsheet. And she laughed and said, I'm serious. People will spend money to feel good, but only if you actually want that for them. And she pulled out a legal pad and we sketched a tiny business that could exist in a corner of the world. a fitting studio that did alterations and consignment for fancy dresses and custom work for real women who wanted a dress to fit their life, not the other way around. And I wrote at the top of the page, Fieldstone Fitting, because the old Cream City brick in our city looks like Fieldstone, and also because I wanted a name that sounded like you could lean on it. And I went home with 2 bolts of fabric my aunt pressed into my arms, and a list of vendors who owed her favors, and a belief that my rage could be a tool and not just a burn. Act 2 always thinks it is a bully. It came at me with a timeline: 3 weeks until peak summer wedding season, 2 cronies who smelled change, and an owner who liked my sales numbers more than my mouth. Kelsey and Brooke started a whisper that I was jealous of their followers, and they got bolder after someone in corporate reposted one of their confidence campaign squares, and Leora pulled me aside and said, "Can you try to be a team player?" And I said, "I am the team." And she said, "You know what I mean?" And I said, "I do. And I'm telling you, we are on a slippery floor." And she said, "Enough," and wrote me up for creating negative energy. And I signed the paper with my neat signature and wrote next to it, "Refuses to participate in body shaming." And she sighed because she likes things that slide into drawers without catching. And I went home and looked at my notebook and added step 6, secure a lease, and step 7, secure stock, and step 8, secure customers. And I called the number on a listing I had bookmarked months ago, a tiny storefront 2 blocks from the farmer's market, and a man named Armin answered and said, "The last tenant left a sewing table and an industrial machine, and I don't want to move them." And I said, "I will take them." And he said, "Bring first month and a modest deposit." And I said, "I have half." And he said, "Bring it and we'll make payments for the rest." And I went to my bank and pulled the money I had saved from freelance alterations I do in my kitchen on a singer older than me. And I signed a lease with a key ring that bit my palm and made me feel alive. And then I called 3 consignment clients, women I had met at Maison Leora, who trusted me more than they trusted beige rooms, and I told them I was opening a studio, and would they consign their gowns that wedding guests never returned for. And they said yes, because dresses want to be wanted. And then I made a flyer on my cousin's old laptop with a photo of my hands pinning a hem, and I printed 20 and taped them in coffee shops where women sit with laptops, and hope, and outside yoga studios where women learn to breathe without apology. And I branded it with the line, "We fit the dress to you, not you to the dress." And I slept 3 hours because the voice of a risk is loud the first week. And then Tuesday brought the first 2 appointments booked from a flyer, a nurse named Shayla with a bridesmaid dress that needed a new zipper and mercy, and a professor named Anita who wanted a satin jumpsuit hemmed without losing the swing, and both of them paid deposits. And I cried on the bus, because 2 deposits is a life raft if you remember how to kick. Maison Leora did not cheer. Kelsey started throwing little darts, calling my phone Fieldstone behind my back and in front of my face. Brooke said, "Good luck with your charity." And Leora scheduled me for fewer fittings and more steaming, a petty thing that eats time and fingers. And she put Kelsey and Brooke on the front desk where tips live. And I told myself, this is the part where they push while you build. And I built. I swept my little studio floors and washed the window and bought a roll of brown paper for the cutting table. I borrowed a dress form from my aunt and put it in the window in a silk dress that a woman named Tessa had worn once and loved too much to shove in a box. And I wrote a rack card for sizes 14 to 32 that said, "We carry you." And I asked my cousin to make a simple website with a booking button and a text that did not apologize for my prices because my prices paid for thread and light and a life. And I posted once on my own social with a photo of my sewing machine and a caption, "Now open, by appointment," the way a person whispers to the right ears. The worst day came right before the turn. It always does. A Saturday when Hallie came back to Maison Leora for her final fitting, and the gown that had been perfect was cut wrong by an outside alterations contractor. The waist had been taken in on one side and the hip on the other, and the result was a dress that leaned and a bride who broke. And I felt the blood drain to my shoes, because this was not fixable in the hour she had left before her out-of-town parents were leaving. And I looked at Leora, and she looked at me, and then at Kelsey and Brooke, and no one moved. And I made a decision that ended one job and started the next one for real. I took Hallie's hand and said, "Come with me now." And I grabbed the dress and my rolling kit. And I walked her out the back door and into my little car and drove the 8 minutes to Fieldstone. And I put her on the dress form and I took a breath. And I let my hands do the thing they know how to do. I let out the wrong seams and steamed them flat, and took in the right ones and eased the curve with a line of hand stitches that would not show. And I gave the dress a gentle, stern talking to, reminding it that women are not math problems. And in 40 minutes, the curve matched the person. And she stood on my little riser and cried the good kind again and said, "You saved my wedding." And I said, "You saved your wedding by trusting your instinct to leave a room that did not deserve you." And I drove her back and dropped her at the curb with a kiss on her cheek and a promise to be at the church in case anything popped. And I went around to Maison Leora's back door with the empty garment bag, and Leora was there with her arms crossed, and she said, "You cannot take clients from the shop." And I said, "I did not take her. You gave her away by letting the wrong people touch her dress." And she said, "You're fired." And I said, "I know." And she said, "You'll be blacklisted." And I said, "By whom?" "A list of people who don't like mirrors." And she said, "You're dramatic." And I said, "I'm explicit." And I handed her my key and walked out of the alley into sun that made the new paint on my little sign look like honey. Being fired with your name still hot in people's mouths is a mixed gift, because in the same hour that I lost my paycheck, Hallie posted a photo on her private account of my hands smoothing her waist with the caption, "This woman saved me, DM me if you need her," and 10 bridesmaids DM'd her, and 3 DM'd me, and one of them was Naomi, who had cried in the bathroom, and one was Tessa, who had consigned the silk dress, and one was Shayla the nurse, who said, "Can I bring my sister too?" And I booked them. And then a blogger in town who had worn a Maison Leora dress 2 years ago wrote a post about shopping without shame and mentioned me by first name and street. And 2 more consignment dresses found their way to my rack. A structured Mikado in a hopeful 16, a chiffon A-line that used to be a 12 and was now a 14 because I let the seams live. Then came the point where Act 2 tries to take your legs out from under you. The landlord called, because Leora had called him because she used to rent my little space 10 years ago before she moved to the big corner. And she told him I had broken a non-compete that said I could not do alterations within a mile. And I went to my file cabinet, which is a cardboard box with tabbed folders, and pulled my signed copy of my Maison Leora contract and showed him that the non-compete I signed only applied to sales, not to sewing. And he laughed and said, "I like paper." And I said, "Me too." And he hung up and called Leora back and told her to mind her mannequins. And that night, Kelsey posted a reel making fun of DIY bridal basements, and 30 women commented asking for my address, and she deleted it because sometimes the internet does revenge for you when you keep your head. With 3 weeks of rent paid and 4 weeks of appointments on the books, and my aunt's rotary cutter living on my table like a blessing, I settled into a rhythm that made sense. Mornings were hems, afternoons were try-ons, evenings were emails and spreadsheets and sweeping, and I kept my prices transparent and my tone plain. No magic, no miracles, just work. And still, because the world is the world, one more blow landed, Brooke's cousin, who works at a local magazine, wrote a small piece accusing pop-up fitters of cutting corners and cut-rate ethics. And she did not name me, but she named my block. And a city inspector came by to measure my space and check my occupancy and my fire extinguisher. And I passed because I had read the code like a bedtime story. And he said, "I've never seen a place this new with its paperwork this neat." And I said, "Rage is tidy when you use it right." And he laughed because grown men like a line that sounds like a coffee mug. 2.5 months after the Saturday I left with Hallie in my car, Leora sent an all-staff text at 11:02 p.m. that said, "Emergency meeting tomorrow," and I did not go because I was not staff, but a customer did, and she stood at my counter later and told me what was said, that sales were down because confidence had become a meme with teeth, that the corporate office wanted to see new leadership at the front of the store, and that Kelsey and Brooke would be on probationary leave, while the brand re-centered. And I did not cheer out loud because I do not believe in trophies for basic decency, but I did close my eyes and thank the version of myself who wrote the memo, and the version of myself who kept a ledger, and the version of myself who did not throw a steaming kettle of anger at the wrong wall. And then I opened my eyes and got back to work because revenge that stops at a headline is just gossip. The climax did not come with screaming. It came on a quiet Wednesday when I was binding a hem, and a man in a navy blazer with a neat beard walked in with a folder and a pen and said, "I'm Mark, and I own the building where Maison Leora sits." And I said, "Do you need a hem?" And he laughed and said, "I need a manager." And I said, "I'm not for hire." And he said, "I know. I've heard." And he told me a story about a store that needed to change fast if it wanted to keep its lease. And he said, "I offered Leora a plan. She turned it down. She thinks she can ride it out. I'm not sure she can." And I said, "What is your plan?" And he said, "Take over the space. Rebrand as a client-first boutique with alterations on site. Hire a GM who actually knows how to fit. Partner with local makers. Focus on size inclusivity because it's the right thing and the profitable thing. And pay the GM a salary plus a percentage of net." And I said, "You're here to offer me a job signing paychecks for the people who laughed at my dress size." And he said, "I'm here to offer you ownership with training wheels, a profit share now, and an option to buy into the business next year." And I said, "You think I won't bring my fury to work?" And he said, "I think your fury already built a business." And I stared at my sewing machine because it is the most honest thing I own. And I said, "I will not run a room that makes women apologize for air they consume." And he said, "Good, because rooms that make people apologize run out of oxygen." And I said, "I want contract language that protects my studio fieldstone because I built it from the threads of my evenings." And he said, "Done. Bring your lawyer cousin or your aunt or your dog. I don't care. I just need a spine." And I said, "I have that." And he said, "I know." And he left a draft and a card and walked out. And I looked at my calendar and my bank account and my aunt's legal pad, and I knew the shape of what had come. The chance to make the room I had asked for in someone else's house, and then had started in my own. I called Dana, the same lawyer who had told a friend of mine how to draw a boundary without setting a fire, and I paid for an hour and sent her the draft. And she read and highlighted and said, "Ask for 3 things. Control of hiring, a clause that protects your speech when you enforce dignity, and a severance if the owner ever tries to push you out for doing what you were hired to do." And I did. And Mark agreed because savvy men like clean lines. And 2 days later, he called to say the lease transfer had been signed, and Maison Leora would close on Friday and reopen in 2 weeks as Fieldstone Bridal and Tailor with me as general manager and founding partner. And I sat on my studio stool and laughed out loud in the empty room because empty rooms are where laughter lands best. And then I called my aunt, and she cried and then laughed, and then told me to remember to use her vendor discount on thread. And I called my mother, and she said, "Do not work for anyone who doubts your tape measure." And I said, "I won't." And I put down the phone and picked up my notebook and wrote in neat letters, "Hire team, print policies, order chairs that do not punish hips, and draft a schedule where water is a job, not a treat." And then I wrote at the bottom in smaller letters, "Tell Kelsey and Brooke to show up on time Monday or not at all." Opening day was not a parade, it was a checklist sung out loud. I unlocked the glass door at 7, flipped the sign to soft open, and walked the floor with my tape measure around my neck and my policy binder in my hand. The one that said in plain lines that no one comments on bodies. Everyone offers water. No one whispers about tags. Everyone learns the difference between a pin that holds and a pin that hurts. I had hired fast and right. Shayla the nurse took weekends to run fittings and emergencies because nurses are the best calm you can hire. Anita the professor worked 2 afternoons to manage intake and make sure our words were clear. My aunt stood in the back for the first week to chant small wisdoms like a gentle metronome. Measure twice, never tug, mercy on the curve. And I gave Ted, the landlord, a respectful nod when he poked his head in and said the city inspector had signed off on our remodel. And then I went to the small room behind the register and opened the safe and took out the first stack of paychecks I had ever signed with my name on the line that says authorized, and I felt the shape of my signature as a door more than a flourish. And then the bell on the glass door chimed, and the first bride of the rebrand walked in with her mother and her future mother-in-law, like nervous geese. And I showed them chairs that did not punish hips and mirrors that did not lie, and they relaxed because the room told them the truth before I had to. And we fitted and pinned, and I kept one ear on the front, where Mark was quietly checking that the new sign hid the old name completely because ghosts need disinviting too. And at 9:30 the back door creaked, and I knew the temperature of the room had changed. Kelsey and Brooke stepped in as if the floor still owed them deference, lips painted, phones in their hands like shields. And I met them halfway with a clipboard and said, "On time is 5 minutes early," and they glanced at the clock and pretended not to understand the joke. And I said, "Your job descriptions were sent on Friday. Did you read them?" And Kelsey said, "I skimmed." And Brooke said, "We know this work." And I said, "You know a version of this work that ends today." And I walked them to the staff table and handed them each a copy of the policy with my name and the owner's name, and Dana's careful sentences about speech and consequence. And I said, "Sign and we begin. Decline and we part." And Kelsey looked at the line that barred commentary on bodies and said, "You can't tell me what to think." And I said, "I do not care what you think. I care what you say and do in a room where women pay to be treated as if their skin belongs to them." And Brooke squinted at the clause about phones and said, "No filming without written consent, really." And I said, "Yes, because we are not content. We are people who wear dresses and then go home and eat dinner." And they both flicked their eyes toward the windows where the old world had been, and the new one was rising, and I stood and said nothing, and let the air be my ally until they signed, because some arguments end when evidence stands still, and the future looks like a mirror that finally fits. And I assigned them to steaming and backstock, not to punish, but to make them touch things that hiss and require patience. And I pulled Anita to the front and said, "You'll shadow me at the desk. Your pen is cleaner than mine." And she laughed because she is not a woman who needs flattery to stand upright. And we moved through the day like a good hem, invisible to the eye, but holding the whole dress in place. 7 appointments, 2 fittings rescued from other stores that had cut corners, 3 water refills offered without being asked, 2 mothers who had to be gently told that their daughters are not sewing machines. They do not need to be tightened to work, and a playlist that made the light lean in. And at lunch, I went into the back to sign the first round of checks. my hand steady, the amount fair, the memo field honest, hours, not favors. And when I came out with envelopes, Kelsey tried to reach for hers before I called her name, and I held it back for half a second so she could feel who was distributing dignity now, and she felt it, and took the envelope with a thank you, pinned to a face that is not used to saying thank you. And Brooke asked about raises before her first week, and I said, raises are built with clean days and happy clients, not with a wish you wrote in lip liner, and the staff laughed the way nervous people laugh when the truth walks across the room in heels that do not wobble. And then I made a point of walking Kelsey and Brooke through a real fitting where a size 20 woman named Margot came in with shoulders tight and hands in fists, and I let them hover behind and watch. As I greeted Margot the way you greet a person about to climb a hill, with a hand and not a shove, I measured without announcing numbers because numbers are not crimes. I chose 3 gowns with structure that said, I will carry you, not, I will display you. And when she stepped out and saw herself and made the small sound of a person who did not think joy was a room she could enter, I watched Kelsey's mouth forget its jokes, and Brooke's hands forget their filming. And when the veil went on and Margot's mother cried kindly, not meanly, I looked at both of them and said, this is the only content we create. And they nodded because the lesson had made a better dent than any memo ever would have, and they steamed and pinned and fetched water, and no one whispered about tags, not because they feared me, because the room had been built so the whispers had nowhere to land. We worked like that for 2 weeks, replacing old habits with the new furniture of a different world, soft chairs, a self-serve water station, a cubby with emergency pads and hair ties because women always need 10 small things no one budgets for. A framed copy of the line that said, we fit the dress to you, not you to the dress, and I let my stubborn spine do its work while my hands did theirs. And then came the day that mattered for the narrative that had landed me here, a Thursday deposit and the payroll cycle that followed. The week I signed both Kelsey's and Brooke's paychecks and handed them over across a counter where the old hierarchy would have made them feel taller. And I watched them realize with a blink and a swallow that their names lived under mine for money now, not the other way. And I did not gloat because gloating is a cheap hem that unravels in rain. I simply slid the envelopes and said, thank you for a clean week. The reviews were kind. Keep going. And they said, thank you, in voices that had discovered the dignity in service when service is not code for humiliation. And after they left for their break, Anita leaned over and said, how does it feel? And I said, like a straightened table. And she laughed and wrote that on a sticky note and stuck it to the cash drawer, because sticky notes become doctrine when they are earned. And then, because life loves symmetry and a twist, Leora walked in, the bell chime turning into a small alarm in my chest. She looked smaller in our light, not because she was, because posture is a habit and habits change by accident when the room is different. And she said, I want to see the new place. And Mark came out from the back with a landlord's smile and said, of course. And she walked the aisles and touched a skirt and nodded at the emergency basket and did not speak until she reached the counter. And then she said, you run a tight ship, Serena. And I said, I run a kind room. And she looked around and said, I lost my good manager and got a competitor with a better reputation. And I said, you lost your good manager when you let your worst employees decide what the room smelled like. And she winced because clean truth stings. And she said, I'm opening a smaller space uptown. Maybe we can refer to each other. And I said, I will refer when your policies look like mine. And she said, fair. And she left without slamming anything because slamming is for doors and we have glass. And after she left, Kelsey let out a breath she had been holding for a decade and said, I did not know I would ever be grateful for a memo. And I said, you're not grateful for a memo. You're grateful for a standard. And she nodded because she had learned one new word that month, and it was the right one. Act 3 was not just confrontation, it was consequence and construction in the same breath. I coached the team through a full Saturday with 8 back-to-back appointments and no missteps. I handled a disaster gracefully when a zipper popped, and we hand-stitched a temporary fix, while Anita told the client a story about a philosopher who invented a word for staying calm while fixing reality. We comped alterations for a teacher who had saved for a year, and I wrote it in the ledger as marketing because language pays bills when it's honest. We sold 3 consignment gowns to women who never thought they would use the word love about fabric. And I ended the day with a closing checklist that included petty, important things like empty the steamer, count the pins, mop the floor, and sign the checks. And with each stroke of my pen, I felt my mother's kitchen in mine, her old singer breathing through my hands, her voice telling me to iron the seam before I show the client because wrinkles are only rude if you try to pretend they are not there. And on the Monday that followed, I held our first staff meeting not in the back room like a punishment, but on the floor with chairs in a circle like a promise. And I read the reviews aloud, not the ones that praised me, the ones that praised small kindnesses, the water station, the chairs, the silence around numbers. And I told Shayla she could add a note to our intake form asking if the client wanted silence or cheer in the fitting room, because not everyone wants a chorus and some people want a solo. And I told Kelsey to design the window with the plus-size mannequin front and center, because front and center is not a prize, it is a reflection. And she did it without rolling her eyes because she had watched 10 women in 2 weeks stop bracing when they saw themselves in the glass. And I told Brooke to build a photo policy with Anita that protected people and still allowed their joy to be shared when they wanted. And she came back with a draft that made me underline 3 sentences and send it to Dana with a note. Can we use this to teach other stores? And Dana wrote back, yes, and also build a template we can license. And I laughed because justice sometimes also builds a side business if you keep your paperwork neat. And then, the day I had been moving toward since the laugh in the back room came like a bell you did not set, and still knew would ring, Hallie returned in her first anniversary dress for a new hem and brought cupcakes and a card and 3 friends who each booked an appointment. And she stood at my counter and said, "Do you remember the tent joke?" And I said, "I remember where the air tasted of it." And she said, "I tell that story now as the opening to how I learned to walk out of rooms that do not want me." And I said, "I tell the version where you taught me how to leave faster." And she put her hand over mine and said, "Thank you for starting this." And behind her, I saw Kelsey at the steamer glance up and then down. Not ashamed now, aware, the way a person is when they realize they used to chew on something sharp and call it candy. And I exhaled a breath I had been holding since March, and the room shifted a quarter inch towards something like a home. The consequences for the old world kept arriving in small envelopes and big ones. The magazine that had smeared pop-up fitters ran a correction featuring us and 3 other boutiques that had changed policy. The blogger who had first whispered my name did a follow-up piece about what it feels like to shop in a room built by a woman who has been sized by rooms her whole life. Mark went to a landlord meeting and taught other building owners how to write ethics into their leases. A tiny wave in a tiny city that still felt like a tide. And I wrote a short, clear handbook that we printed and gave free to any shop owner who asked. The Fieldstone Code, 6 pages, 12 sentences, 1 drawing of a chair with the caption, "If a chair cannot hold her, it does not belong in your store." And I sent a copy to Leora uptown with a handwritten note. Use, if it helps. Sign your name to it. Our names do not have to live on opposite walls. And she wrote back a 3-word text. I will try. And that is a miracle spoken softly. The only kind I trust. The twist, because every long story deserves a small, clean twist at the end like a ribbon that keeps the box closed without tape. came on a Tuesday afternoon when a courier delivered a thin envelope addressed to me with a familiar handwriting that had once signed my reprimand. It was a letter from corporate headquarters of the old brand, not an apology, a request. They wanted to license the Fieldstone Code for their training. They offered a modest fee and asked if I would consult on implementation. And before saying yes, I called my mother, because even general managers with a spine still call their mothers when money meets principle. And she said, "Charge them and make them use your exact sentences. Do not let them pretty it up until it is fog again." And I laughed and said, "I love you." And I sent a reply with a price and a clause that said the code must be printed and posted in employee rooms at eye level. And they agreed. And a month later, a friend at a store 2 states over sent me a photo of my sentence about numbers not being crimes taped to a mirror. And I sat at my little back table and cried alone, because crying at work used to mean fear, and now it meant relief. And then I wiped my face and cut a hem, because relief is not an excuse to be late. So here is my new normal. I run Fieldstone Bridal and Tailor with a stubborn spine and a soft tape measure. I sign paychecks for people who now do not need to be terrified to earn them, including 2 women who told me privately that their jokes were armor and they had set it down and were lighter now. I still keep a tote with a notebook and a tape and my mother's thimble. I still sweep my own floor on bad days because clean lines fix my head. I take the bus sometimes because it slows my blood and shows me faces not in my appointment book. I eat lunch standing some days because a zipper waits for no one. I stop and drink water because we wrote that into the schedule, and schedules change lives when you follow them. I walk out to the sidewalk at the end of a hard shift and watch couples argue and make up, and kids lick popsicles, and a grandmother carry a bag of apples, and I feel the particular satisfaction of a woman who took a laugh and built a ledger from it. A woman who knew that dignity is not a dress, it is a policy, it is a paycheck. It is saying no with a key in your hand and yes with a chair under someone you just met. And on Sunday mornings, I take my notebook to a diner and plan the week. And sometimes Kelsey sits across from me with her own notebook, and we compare windows and water pitcher styles like women planning an army that will never have to march. And sometimes Brooke brings a mock-up for a consent form that is clearer than last time, and I say good work and mean it. And sometimes I walk past the mirror in the front with the new decal that says, "You are not a size, you are a story." And I catch my reflection, size 18 and steady, and I think of the day in March when they laughed, and I kept my hands kind and my mouth exact, and my feet moving toward a different room, and I smile at my mirror self like a woman I would hire, and I go back to the work, which is pinning and hemming and training and paying and refusing in 10,000 small ways to ever let a laugh decide the size of the room again.